Hello and welcome to the gallery. My name is Jon. Let's go into the finer minutiae of a base. This week we are continuing on with the Golden Demon model project that we started on a month ago. We are starting with painting the base. I like to start from the base so I can work from the ground up, so to speak. But before we start the airbrushing, I would like to point out that this will be quite a long video and I will be breaking it up into chapters because there's a lot of ground to cover, so to speak. Let's jump into the airbrushing. Now the first stage of getting this base, dioramic base, ready for what I want is getting some base coats on it. I'll be using the zenithal that I put on as rough guidelines, but I won't be using that too much. It's more of a guideline. I'm starting with lubrical green and I have this quite thin and I'm using different layering techniques here. Well, mainly just different amount of layers. I'm getting all the natural texture that is here with the lubrical green because I like this green theme that the original artwork that I'm having in the back of my mind had. Now for the rock textures, I'm using more of a Corvus black, and that's also on the rocks there and on the slates underneath, just to have some different look to it, and it's not as shiny as Abaddon black, so I'm using the Corvus black. For some quick and easy highlights to begin with, I'm using Fenrisian Grey. I'm hitting that where the OSL will be both strongest and also just to get a little bit of a different feel to the actual texture of everything. Even the stuff that will later on be painted in some sort of metallic will be painted with this, just so I have the total feel from this point onwards. So this light blue-gray is the first start of the highlight. Then I'm going in with a white. And this is quite an intense white, so I have it fairly thinned out, and I'm hitting mainly just the center portions of where any OSL will be, where the light will be hitting, just so I have this feeling still going for it. It's basically like I'm doing zenithal again, but this time I'm focusing where I'm putting every little drop of paint. And that is the idea with these Golden Demon things. You have to focus on every little aspect. Whether they use airbrush a lot for it, I don't know. I'm using it a fair bit, and that's just to do the main brunt work. Later on I will do focused a little bit more with a brush. Now I have the idea that the flames and everything will be this yellowy green color. So a little bit of yellow paint, a medium yellow from Leo, and I'm painting that on the OSL that I already done, just so I get these lights that I wanted going, just so I get the start of the light already from the get-go. I'm not doing anything of the OSL variety after the fact. It's part of the painting process. And I will have a little bit of light source there as well, so a little bit of light will be there as well. Now it feels a little bit flat, the base colors, so I decided to bring in an olive paint and just a little bit of dop here and there, just to make it a little bit more interesting and not as monotonous. So a little bit of green on the rock, give it a little bit of a sickly feel, and a little bit of green on the ground texture here and there, just so we have this feeling that this is a lived-in ground. It's been seeped with disgust and chaos elements for years and years, so we have this a little bit more. It's not just the one color underneath all the other colors, it's a few colors. There's some depth to the paint job, and as a beginning step I think this looks just pretty darn okay. Now that we've gotten the main tones down, let's start working on a little bit of extra depth to them. So we're going to go into a little bit of shading and underpainting into these base tones that we already have. Now to continue on with the actual base, I'm going to use some shades, and I have these 3 brushes here. One is sort of fine, one is not that sort of fine, one is really messed up. And the main thing is here, I just want to add a little bit of extra tones to the base. Just some undertones, because we will be using dry brushing and stuff like that later on. It's not too much of a hassle doing big bases and having them look good. Dry brushing and shades work perfectly fine if you focus it, not just willy-nilly here and there, but focus it. Starting with Drugy Violet on the more shadowy areas of the rock mainly, putting down one thick layer, then moistening my brush and feathering it out, giving it a natural texture. And I think that's what really sells bases, is having them feel natural. Even if they are technical or something like that, or mechanical, natural is still the way to go. Even for the mechanical, then you want the grime, you want the grit, you want the dirt, you want it lived. So on the underside here, I go really full ham with the Drugy Violet. And of course, I'm still feathering it because we don't want any sharp lines. And we want it natural. That's the key thing here. A little bit here on the top side just to connect the back portion with the front portion, but not too much, just a little bit, and then feathering it out, always with the feathering. And it's perfectly easy to feather these shades because they are so wet and they take so well to feathering. And immediately you start seeing it come a little bit more alive, and it feels a little bit more eldritchy and horror-y and demonic-y. This might be some sort of demon world, and that's fine. A little bit of extra here into the pavement and into the flagstones and into the stairs, just to give that same feel. And for the flagstones, I really want to shade just in between, and that's fine if it goes a little bit overboard. You can just moisten the brush and feather it away. For the deepest part of the rocks and the shadows, I'm using Neon Oil, putting that on and feathering it again, just like I did with the Drugy Violet. It's just a little bit more focused this time, and it's a little bit more into the deeper shadows. It's not as big of a paint job as I did with the Drugy. It's just a little bit here, a dollop here and there, and it's more focused where I want some shadows to be that I don't see them yet. And feathering it again, that's the main thing. And even a little bit more here on the steps and on the flagstones, just to have those different values and the opportunity of different values. We want this to look as real as demon worlds are gonna look. And that is the main idea. Now for some of the more flat pieces, I'm using Beeltan Green. I'm putting a little bit of a W in the middle, and then I'm just feathering it out and thinning it out on the actual base, just to have some extra color going there. It felt a little bit flat and monotonous, so a little bit of Beeltan Green here and there, just to give some sort of variant to the base and the look. And that's basically the undershading done of this base. And now that all the groundwork is done, the base is looking smooth as anything. Let's start bringing up some highlights on it with a little bit of dry brushing. Now let's get some highlights on this. We've done a fair few bits of underpainting. Now let's get some highlights. I'm starting out with Sons of Horus Green. And I'm going to dry brush this over all the ground texture and a little bit over the rocks, just to get some sort of color going there that is a little bit higher in the color gradient than the one we already have. And be very smooth, because even though this is simple methods, is base coating, shade and dry brush, we still want it to look cool, because this is gonna be a base for a Golden Demon model, well, a competitor. For the rock textures, I'm using the Fang, because I want it to be a little bit more carved and more created and more rock-like. So for the steps, the flagstones, and a little bit on the rocks, I'm using the fang, and this will give us a different tone than the green. It'll be more, well, rocky and less natural, even though the green of this base is fairly not natural. It's very sickly and warp glowy, which is the thing I'm going for, so that's perfectly fine, well, at least in my opinion. And we're dry brushing that over most of the rock, just the top pieces. We want the darker shade, but we already have there, because it's gonna be quite dark in there. So we're just putting a little bit here and then a little bit there. We're continuing with dry brushing, and now we're going for nurgling green, and it's a little bit softer dry brush than before, still over the ground textures. Just getting some extra highlights there, getting a little bit extra definition, even putting it a little bit on the rock faces just to tie it a little bit better together. And it makes it look a little bit more alive, and that's the idea. Have it a little bit more alive and a little bit more interesting and more natural. After the nurgling green is stopped, we work on the rocks again, this time with rust grey, a little bit lighter tone of grey, and again, like with the nurgling green, a little bit of a smoother dry brush, and on the stairs, mainly the corners. On the rocks, mainly the corners. This is the first step of the sort of natural edge highlighting, weathering effect that we're going for here. And immediately it starts to look a little bit more interesting, a little bit more alive. There are some variants in the colors. Grabbing some corners of the rock, just a hint here and there. Nothing overboard, nothing too focused, nothing too manic, just a little bit of a hint here and there. Being careful not to have too much on the brush, just so we get these tiny hints of different colors. For the ground texture, we're ending up with wraithbone. A little bit of a off color from the green, but it will grab the edge as well and make it feel a little bit more different, a little bit more alive, and gives it extra depth. And it's very soft. We have little on the brush and a very soft brush stroke. As you can see, I'm gently caressing the base, just getting those colors a little bit highlighted and a little bit more interesting. Fenrisian grey is the last color of the flagstones and the rock textures, and we're going for just the corners here, making them sharp and worn and old. Like we did with the wraithbone, this is smooth moves, just gently brushing and leaving a small residue of color where we want it to be left. A little bit here on the top of the two rocky formations and on the sharpest corners of the rocks. And we get this lovely natural looking rock texture going and a lovely natural looking ground texture going. We will add a little bit later on to that, a little bit later on, but for now the actual ground texture and rock texture is basically done. And now that the dry brushing is done, let's hit those little spots that will have OSL on them with some simple effects. Now I want to add a little bit to the hint of an OSL that I have already. I have some matte white and on the dry brush, and I'm dry brushing that in a circular motion and back and forth, just a little bit on the brush, not leaving too much at once and just leaving it where I want it to be. I'm going back and forth both on this rock and on the other rock, and a little bit on the poles there and on the little corner of the base there. I just want to leave a hint of white here and there, just so I have something to add the light onto. So back and forth, take it slow, take it easy. This is a simple way to do OSL, but still you have to be a little bit careful. Now over these white pieces that I'm putting putting Lamenter's Yellow. It's a glaze paint. I don't know if it's made anymore. You could use inks, you could use washes, you could use contrast paints or whatever. I like this paint. It's thin, it works well with feathering with water, and I like the tone it gives, and that's the main idea here. It has the tone that I want for the fire that I will make later on. It's this greenish, yellowish warp flame thing, and I like that. And I'm putting that over all the pieces where I put white and feathering it out a little bit so the tone is illuminating everything around it a little bit. And this is the same method that I will use for most of the OSL for this paint job. White and Lamenter's Yellow. Okay, the main brunt of the base is done. Now we have to start working on the details, and there are a fair few details on this base that we will go into. However, first I would like to mention my Patreon campaign underneath. That's the best way to help me fund this channel and help me do this stuff. So if you're interested, by all means click on that. There are some different tiers with various things on it. Also, I have this Amazon affiliate store where you can get many items, both model making and painting and everything like that, at no extra cost to you. It'll be a small kickback from me, but like I said, no extra cost for you. If you don't feel like doing any of that, it's perfectly fine. Just watch the video and hopefully you enjoy it. Like and share, that's something you can do if you feel like it. Anyway, let's start working on the details, and the first thing are the skulls. Now let's start working on the details of this base. We're starting with the skulls. I'm using a dryad bark, and I will be using skeleton bone as well as bone white. And then on the end where we will have some OSL, I'm also using matte white and Lamenter's Yellow like we did on the base. Now I want some mid-tones of these colors, so I'm putting a little bit of the dryad bark, mixing that with a little bit of the skeleton bone, and so I get this mid-tone between the two colors. And then I will use a little bit of the skeleton bone mixed with a little bit of the bone white, so we get that mid-tone going as well. And then finally a little bit of the bone white mixed with white, so we get even a higher highlight. And then, of course, where the OSL will hit, we get this tiny dot of pure matte white just to grab the Lamenter's Yellow that we want to have as the light source. And these are the paints that we'll be using for the skull, so we won't go over that while we are painting. And the main idea here is to work from darkest to light. We're not using any shade for this piece because we want all the details to be as crisp as we want them to be. So where the highlights and the shadows are is where we put them, not where the shade flew into them. So we're starting out by putting the dryad bark on all the skulls and bones. Then we are roughly highlighting it with the mixture of the dryad bark and the skeleton bone, leaving the darkest recesses still in the brown. And I'm thinning the paint with a little bit of water, and I have a moist brush just so it will dry a little less opaque and it will mix a little bit better together. Once that layer is done, we're highlighting again, and this time there's a little bit less that we're highlighting. We're always focusing closer and closer to the light source, closer and closer to the most profound details, leaving the shadows a little bit darker every single step, so everything looks a little bit more interesting and a little bit more real. Again, slightly leaving more darker recesses, slightly leaving a little brighter spots on it. And I must say, this takes a little bit of time to paint the skulls like this, but it was so worth it. They look much better than any other skulls I've ever painted in my days. Just a little bit of here and there, always a little bit brighter, always a little bit more interesting. And be careful where you lift your brush, because that's where the biggest part of the paint will be left. As you can see, they are looking a lot nicer than most of the skulls I've painted so far. But of course, I spent quite a long time painting these skulls, and now we're hitting them with a little bit of a yellow. The light will be hitting them there from the model, so this is illuminated a little bit different than the other skulls, but it'll make sense later on. I must say I like how the skulls came out, but there are more details to touch on with different methods, so we're jumping into the scrolls next. Now let's start working on the next detail, and that is all the scrolls that I've put on this base. I'm painting this a little bit differently than before. I'm starting out with flat earth, then a little bit of khaki, a little bit of dark tan, a little bit of pallid witch flesh. That's the main colors that I will be using for the scrolls. I will not be finding mid-tones, and in this case I'll be using thinner layers, and I will be using different methods to paint it to get this little bit rougher look to it than the skulls. It's like crumpled paper, parchment thing that I want to go for. Also, I have Corvus black, and that'll be used mainly for all the writing on the scrolls. And then of course matte white for the brightest highlights that I will glaze with Lamenter's yellow later on. Let's start by brushing the flat earth on all the scrolls that I have put here on the base, just so we have this nice warm worn undertone to work from. These are 4 scrolls that I put here, and then I'm gonna start by putting on the khaki. I'm dragging the paint. I'm trying to get a little bit of texture to it. I want it to feel a little bit rough because we want this crumpled old parchment look to it. Of course, I'm still leaving the shadows in the darker color. And like I said, this is quite thin paint, so it becomes quite opaque when it dries. Now, the first layer of highlights, and this is basically still base coat, is the dark tan, and I will be dragging that quite a lot here and there, crisscrossing it on all the scrolls, so we get this more natural, fibrous look to them. So back and forth, getting some sort of different texture. It's not as smooth as the skulls, it's more crumpled, it's more interesting. Then we start highlighting it, and for that I'm mixing in a little bit pallid witch flesh, and I'm highlighting it just on the top of the crumples and where light might be hitting it a little bit more and giving it a little bit of a rougher look. Now we need to write on all these scrolls, so not that steady of hand because we want it a little bit squiggly, and a thinned Corvus black will do the trick. It looks like somebody had a lot to say with these word bearers, which does not surprise me one iota. Being careful with this step, because if it pulls or looks really off, it'll look really, really off. As you can see, I've now written on all the scrolls, and now we start with a little bit of extra highlight with matte white, where the tiniest of OSL will hit it later on. And once the matte white has dried, we're going in with the Lamenter's yellow and just tinting the edges and the corners where light will later on hit these things. And then these scrolls are pretty much done. There will be some metallic fastenings on them here and there, but that's a problem for a later stage. Okay, the scrolls and the skulls are done, but before we continue, I would like to get your thoughts on one subject. I have this issue with this entire project, and that is the metallics that will be on this model. I'm not painting the metallics on the base in this video, mainly because I am contemplating, am I gonna go with a really, really, really well done focused TMM or true metallic metals on it, where I will really focus on every little minutia of the metallics, or will I go for NMM, which I am not that proficient in? I know this video is about, and this process is about me trying to find and push me to my limits, but am I at that point where I'm gonna try and push something that I have absolutely no idea how to do well? Are TMMs viable for Golden Demon, or do I have to go with NMM? Please give my thoughts on this. Give your thoughts on this in the comments and help me find the way I want to go with this. I will be painting stuff that is not focused around metallics over the next 2-3 videos, so we can really hone in on this if I'm going for TMM or NMM. But now that that's done, let's go into the wood of this base. Now let's start working on the last piece of detail we'll be doing today. The wood on the base. That means the spiky poles and everything like that. I'm using Incubi Darkness and Dryad Bark that I will mix together to make the first base coat, and it will be this greenish brownish undertone that I will then later on highlight with. And then I have Sandry Dust, matte and matte white, and Lamenter's Yellow, of course, like usually. As you can see, I get this bluish brownish color, which is very nice. I'm going to use that as the base coat for the wood. It'll mix well with what we already have on the base. And then we're mixing the Dryad Bark with the Sandry Dust to get this mid-tone, and then adding a little bit more Sandry Dust to get a highlight color. This will be done in a different way than the other two pieces that we've already done. So there's a different painting method to all these 3 details. That's why I put them all in a separate part of this video. It's not one thing goes for everything. We're starting with the Incubi brown color that I made, and we're putting that as a base coat. Now around the bottom bits, like here, you can see it's a quite different color, and it looks quite different there. So I moisten the brush a little bit and I feather it together so it feels like it's growing from the ground. Now once we've done that, we start layering in the brown, keeping the darkest recesses still in that Incubi brown color, and on the other side of it, we're keeping it a lot darker, of course. So we're laying it in strokes, just up and down, getting a wood texture going. As you can see, we're now hitting a little bit of a lighter color, and we're trying to draw out that wood texture, make it look a little bit more real. Thin paints means they will dry quite opaque, and even if it looks a little bit weird, when it dries, it will be quite faded. So multiple layers, and it'll look really darn good in my opinion. Always another layer, maybe 2-3 layers per actual paint color. But in the end, you will start to see the highlights coming together and looking quite natural. And I like how this looks. It makes me happy in all the right places. Now once we've managed to get this to a point where we like it, we still have to work on that little bit of light that will be hitting it. So for that little bit of light, we're putting extra of the Sandry Dust and then a little bit of white on top of that. Just so we have this bright thing to grab on with the Lamenter's Yellow. And it's a little bit on 2 poles that we will be having light. The outermost poles, 2 of them, those will have a little bit of a hint of a glow to them. And therefore we're focusing on a little bit of the white there, just to put the yellow on top and have it blend into the background that we've already created. Well, the wood, the scrolls, the skulls, the base, everything is ready. However, I felt it was feeling a little bit too nice, so let's make it a little bit more real. Now the base is looking pretty darn good, but it feels like it's missing a little bit of a grittiness and a little bit of realism to it. So I'm using this weathering powder, smoke weathering powder. I'm hitting the recesses of the stairs, I'm hitting the corners here and there, hitting the ground a little bit, starting by putting on a little bit of the smoke powder, then with a moistened brush, feathering it in a little bit, pushing it into the creases and crevices, making it feel a little bit more real and a little bit more alive. Well, or in this case, a little bit more dead actually, because it's quite of a dead to the demonic place that they are. But A little bit here and there, and quite a lot in some places, will really sell the effect of this natural texture. And if we keep it thin enough, we will still have the feeling of the color underneath. And to give it an even more real feel, a little bit of deadland tufts here and there, not going overboard, just a little bit to make it feel a little bit more real and a little bit more alive, like the little grass that tried to live there died, like the rest of everything that seems to be there. And it feels a little bit more real after that. I think we can call it a day for this base, and I like where we ended up. By all means, comment on the TMM and MM thing that I mentioned. Check out the Patreon and everything like that. But now let's jump into the reveal of the base as far as it goes. I'm really liking how this base is coming along. It really gives me an idea of what I want the models to show, how I want the base to interact with the models, because there will be light hitting the base and vice versa. There will be sublights coming from the base and hitting the models. Anyway, thank you very much for joining me here today. There are links in the description for all kinds of stuff, social media, the Patreon, Amazon store, and various tidbits. You do with it what you will. Like, share, and subscribe, and let the colors flow. But until next time, farewell.